do not have rights within those territories? Of course not. Does that mean that we don't have, from a human rights point of view, an enormous tragedy faced by so many millions today as a result of the events of the last decades? Of course not. There are tragedies, there are calamities. But I believe that the starting point for negotiations, for anyone who really wants to get to the bottom of things and hopes to find a solution, is to go back to who was given title.
The issue of a Palestinian state is a very complex one. The way, again, it's put forth to the average population in the West is this is a territory that the Palestinians are fighting for. Hamas is, of course, in the mix. And these people need to have their own Palestinian state. I'd like to know what your feedback is on that.
Okay. We have to be careful because my expertise, as you know, relates to Jerusalem. So if I respond to your question, it's not as an expert on the entire Middle East problem.
Yes.
But let me say this. There is no doubt that a very large segment of what was referred to as Palestine in all the relevant legal documentation is already inhabited by Arabs. I'm referring to Jordan. To suggest today that the spirit and intent of these initial documents was in no way respected is not the truth. Today, there is a very, very large segment of what was Ottoman territory, known as Iraq, a very difficult recent history in that territory. There's another area known as Syria and another known as Lebanon.
Yes.
When the Supreme Council of the Allies pledged to honor certain commitments that had been made during the war to the Arabs, these leaders all said, we've honored these commitments by what we did in Mesopotamia, by what we did in Lebanon, by what we did in Syria. They went even beyond what they had committed by taking 2/3 of what was then Palestine and also giving that to the Arabs under the Hashemite regime. The Hashemites came from Arabia in those days, but the rulers are not former inhabitants of that area, but the majority of those who live in Jordan today can be referred to as Palestinians. So we're now looking at the remnant, this little slice of territory. We can refer to that as West Palestine historically. And we're trying to carve that up and trying to create two viable states in such a small area. No wonder the nations are having so much difficulty. Even if we didn't have all of the religious and political dimensions of the problem, the area is so small that it's very difficult to come up with a solution that pleases everyone.
Okay. Now the leader of Hamas, Khalid Mashal, he came out with a statement that you actually noted there because, strangely enough, it bears a close resemblance to Nehemiah for some reason.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, he made this interesting statement. This is Khalid Mashal, who is the Hamas leader. He's based in Damascus. And basically he said that Jerusalem, for them, for Hamas, is all of Jerusalem, and not only East Jerusalem or the Abu Dis neighborhood of Jerusalem. And he stated that the Zionists have no claim over Jerusalem. I found that the choice of words was rather unique because as it's necessary, as I mentioned before, to study the history, to study the religious underpinnings of the problems. And I take a few words spoken by Nehemiah a long time ago, thousands of years ago, the Hebrew leader, and I read from the Hebrew Bible. And he declared, when confronted by his neighbors, including the Arab leader, referred to as an Arab, he says, the God of heaven will grant us success, and we as servants will start building, but you have no share or claim or stake in Jerusalem. So here we are, so many centuries later, and an Arab leader is saying, Jews, you have no claim. The Jews are continuing to say, no, no, not only do we have a claim, but it's a valid legal claim. So we're in the midst of very intense controversy right now.
Yes.
And for those who continue to study the situation, there's no doubt that the solution is more elusive than ever.
Well, in just listening to what you're saying, it would seem that these two sides, it's irreconcilable. There's no way to somehow bring some kind of a peace based on what you just said of the Hamas leader and what his belief system is about the lands.
Yeah. I wish my conclusion was different, Christine, but the more you look at the dimensions, the many dimensions of the problem, the more you realize how difficult it's going to be to bridge the gaps between the various claimants. I continue to believe that the way to a solution is to have a better understanding of the roots and the underpinnings of the claims of the other parties. If you are a Muslim, you need to understand the history and the religious and the political and the legal aspects of the Jewish claim, and vice versa. And once you have this knowledge, once you have this understanding, perhaps something can be constructed that will last.
Okay, now something we're going to deal with after the break, Dr. Gautier, is you've talked about the Arabs looking at the claims of the Jews, the legal claims that you presented here today. But I'm curious, when you say both sides have to look at one another, I'm curious after the break on what your answer will be to what can the Jewish people do differently to perhaps promote more peace in that region or some kind of a reconciliation. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to our discussion today about who owns Jerusalem. Dr. Jaques Gautier is with me. On the question, Dr. Gautier, about what could the Jews do to perhaps make things better or move toward a reconciliation in this very heated debate about ownership of Jerusalem and other territories as well?
Well, obviously, having spent so many years of my life working on this issue, I've interacted with many Jewish people, Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, and Muslim leaders. One of the problems is that although the Jewish people generally are able to explain the basis of their claim to Jerusalem from a religious perspective, or they're able to do so from an historical perspective, that it's very rare that I meet someone who does have an understanding of the strength of the legal claim. So one of the things that needs to happen is for the Jewish people to be more knowledgeable, more educated concerning their legal rights to Jerusalem. And the reason for that is that very often, whether it's at the United Nations or statements of different governments, what you hear is that the Jews are in Jerusalem illegally, that they are trespassers, that they are occupiers, that they are wrongfully there. Based on my conclusions, they have the right to be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was given to them, subject to certain obligations and restrictions, yes, vis-à-vis the others who are there, but they are not trespassers. They are not illegally residents of Jerusalem, or for that matter, all of what used to be West Palestine. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is this more study, more research, more understanding must be acquired so that when you go to the negotiating table or when you have interaction with others, you don't start off from the perspective that you have no rights to be in Jerusalem.
Okay. Now, the next question I'm going to ask you, Dr. Gautier, I realize, and I want our audience to understand this, that your specialty is on who owns Jerusalem. And you made the case that they have certain rights. Obviously, the religious rights are one thing, but legal rights to Jerusalem. But at the same time, when one knows the rights, who do you present this to? Because we're seeing so many divisions presented. For example, the United Nations Durban II